in effect, be a pawnbroker on other people's emotions.
And what about inflation in closing? What do you see there?
Well, no change. We began this interview with a sort of a soliloquy on Motel 6 charging $69 for a room.
Yeah.
Believe me, the room's no better. Nothing has changed except for that the value of the dollar has gone down 12-fold during the period of time that I have been an adult. And I don't see any of that changing. And I don't want to cast aspersions at our current president. I don't like him any less than I liked our former president. But what the American political establishment has done, and we're not alone, what other political establishments have done as a response to the economic crisis that they saw, is absolutely insane. They have conjured up some amount. Some people will say 12 billion. Others people will say 16. Trillion. I conveniently forgot 3 zeros, just like they do. They have conjured up some amount of, quote, money out of thin air. This is problematic for at least 3 reasons. In the first instance, the U.S. dollar is, of course, a floating abstraction. As Doug Casey famously says, an IOU or an IOU nothing. We have added to the supply of worthless IOUs by not a quantum, but by an enormous amount. It's interesting because, in effect, these guys are counterfeiting. And if Congress and Mr. Obama believe that counterfeiting is a really good thing for the economy, they ought to admit some competition to the sector. They ought to let me do some counterfeiting, too. I think they're unlikely to do that. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the way that they tried to attack the problem implies an extraordinary misunderstanding of the problem. The problem that we had in Western economies is that we were not investing and not saving enough, but we were spending too much, and we were over-indebted. So they cured the problem of overspending by attempting to encourage us to spend more. They attempted to solve the problem of debt-laden government, corporate, and personal balance sheets by increasing the supply of credit and asking us to borrow more. In effect, what Congress has asked us to do is to try and cure a tequila hangover by substituting rum. And that leads to the third problem, which is a moral hazard. They have guaranteed people's responses on a going-forward basis. And so I believe that inflation is absolutely inevitable. Listen, the economy is indirectly, at least in the short term, controlled by politicians. And politicians have a fairly simple binary equation in front of them. They can choose between stalling the problem and stealing your wealth on the installment basis through inflation, which you don't notice, at least during their term, or they can take the pill. They can try and solve the problem. And solving the problem means that people have to pay the bills that they have accumulated over their years, which people hate to do. Things like unemployment, foreclosure, living within your means, not buying a bass boat. That's the sort of thing that gets people kicked out of office. So I think the yields to politicians from inflation are much higher than the yields to politicians from deflation. And as a consequence, I think inflation is absolutely inevitable, and I think people need to plan for it and try, if they can, to find out a way to profit from it rather than merely to survive.
Well, Rick, you've given investors and people listening into the show globally, I think, a tremendous amount of information, basically on how they can capitalize in the next decade going forward in these sectors to position themselves correctly. But let's just say somebody wants to make it easy and come under the umbrella of Global Resource Investments. How do they do that? How do they become a client? Can you give them the website, the phone number, or anything, any type of information?
Sure. I need to give you a disclaimer that our website is fairly basic. It's basic because the Securities and Exchange Commission has said that if broker-dealers violate their website advertising guidelines, that they'll prosecute us aggressively, but they don't have any guidelines. But having said that, go to our website. It's www.gril.net. And if you like what you see there, the best thing to do is pick up a phone and call a living, breathing human being. a guy named Eric Angeli, Mr. Eric Angeli, and he's available at 800-477-7853. That's 800-477-7853. Your listeners could also email me personally, directly. I can be reached at rr@gril.net, rr@gril.net. And I would be delighted to converse with your listeners. I've done that in the past and found it very enjoyable.
Rick Rule, founder of Global Resource Investments, talking to us from New Zealand. Thank you so much for joining us on King World News.
Mr. King, always a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us at kingworldnews.com. Be sure to join us next week where we will have more interviews with the top people in the world.